The footage runs for a handful of seconds and it shows the wrong kind of animal on the wrong kind of surface at the wrong time of day. A gravel runway cut into a mountain meadow in central Idaho. The light is failing. The camera is mounted on the wing strut of a small bush plane coming in on final approach. And what it catches standing near the middle of the strip is not a moose and not a bear and not any of the large animals a pilot expects to clear off a backcountry runway with a low pass and a throttle push. It is upright, it is tall. And as the aircraft passes overhead, it moves off the runway surface toward the tree line in a way that a wildlife biologist who later reviewed the clip described as not matching the biomechanics of any North American species she was aware of. This is a DOGMAN story, not the kind that comes out of Michigan or Wisconsin or the Ohio River Valley where most of the documented reports cluster. This one comes out of the Idaho backcountry. Out of the Frank Church River of no-return wilderness, out of terrain so remote that the nearest paved road from the airstrip in question sits over 50 miles away through mountains that cannot be crossed on foot in anything less than a multi-day pack trip. And the reason you have never heard about it is that the Federal Aviation Administration quietly closed the airstrip in the fall of 2019. Filed the closure under a Forest Service Land Management Authority and buried the 4 pilot incident reports that prompted the action in a database that was never designed to surface them. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. Because what I am about to walk you through involves a piece of aviation infrastructure that a lot of people in the flying community know and care about, and the story of why it was shut down has never been told publicly until now. The man who obtained those incident reports and who spent the better part of 3 years piecing together what they described is a retired air traffic controller. We will call him Hollis. That is not his real name. He asked us to change it, and when you hear what happened to the professional relationships he had spent a career building after he started asking questions about this closure, you will understand why he does not want his name attached to this story. Hollis worked as an air traffic control specialist with the Federal Aviation Administration for roughly a quarter century. He started at the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City in the early 1990s, qualified as a certified professional controller within a few years, and spent his career working positions at facilities across the western United States. For the last stretch of his career, he was assigned to the Boise Terminal Radar Approach Control Facility, known in the system as Boise TRACON, where he handled approach and departure traffic for commercial and general aviation operations across a broad swath of southern and central Idaho airspace. The FAA mandates that controllers retire at age 56. The job is considered so mentally demanding that the agency will not let you do it past that age, regardless of your capability or desire to continue. Hollis hit that mark in late 2018 and separated from federal service the way every controller does, with a pension calculated on his years of service and his highest 3 years of salary, and with the disorienting emptiness of a career that had defined every waking hour of his adult life being over. Controllers are a specific kind of person. The job selects for a cognitive profile that is difficult to describe to someone who has never done it. You are tracking multiple aircraft simultaneously, holding their positions and speeds and altitudes in your working memory while issuing clearances that must be precise, unambiguous, and delivered in a cadence that leaves no room for hesitation. You are making decisions every few seconds that have direct consequences for human life. The stress is constant, the stakes are absolute, and the margin for error is essentially zero. People who do this work for 25 years develop a relationship with precision and situational awareness that does not shut off when they leave the facility. Hollis described it as a permanent change in how a person's brain processes information. You never stop scanning. You never stop tracking. You notice what other people do not notice because your entire professional existence was built on the premise that failing to notice could kill people. After retirement, Hollis and his wife bought a piece of property outside the town of Cascade in Valley County. Cascade sits at the western edge of the Idaho backcountry, a small mountain town along the North Fork of the Payette River that serves as one of the gateway communities for pilots flying into the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. The Frank Church is the largest contiguous wilderness area in the lower 48 states, over 2 million acres of roadless terrain where the Salmon River and its forks have carved deep canyons through granite mountains that rise above 9,000 feet. There are no roads into the interior. Access is by foot, horseback, jet boat on the rivers, or by air. And the air access is what makes Idaho's backcountry unique in American aviation. More than 24 sanctioned airstrips exist within or adjacent to the wilderness boundary, most of them managed by the United States Forest Service or the Idaho Division of Aeronautics. These are not airports. They are gravel or grass runways cut into canyon floors and mountain meadows, many of them less than 2,000 feet long, with approaches that require threading through steep terrain. Flying into them demands specialized skill, and the pilots who do it regularly consider Idaho backcountry flying to be among the most challenging general aviation work in the world. Hollis had held a private certificate with an instrument rating for years, though he had always joked that controllers make terrible pilots because they spend their careers telling other people what to do and then have to follow their own instructions. After retiring, he started flying more. He bought a Piper Super Cub, put oversized Tundra tires on it, and began spending his free time doing what a lot of retired aviators in Idaho do. He flew the backcountry. He camped at the strips. He fished the rivers. He got to know the community of pilots, ranch operators, and Forest Service caretakers who maintained and used these remote facilities. And he volunteered with the Idaho Aviation Association, helping with airstrip maintenance work parties where pilots and volunteers would fly in with tools and equipment to mow grass strips, clear brush from approaches, repair runway markers, and keep these facilities usable for the flying public. It was through this volunteer work that Hollis first became aware of the closure. In the spring of 2020, he was reviewing the NOTAM database as part of his routine flight planning for a trip into the backcountry. NOTAMs are notices issued through the FAA system to alert pilots of conditions that might affect flight safety. Runway closures, equipment outages, temporary flight restrictions, wildlife hazards. Pilots check them before every flight. For backcountry operations, the NOTAMs are particularly important because conditions at remote strips can change overnight. A washout from spring runoff, a tree down on the approach, a bear denning near the runway threshold. You check the NOTAMs, and if a hazard is flagged, you adjust your plans. The NOTAM that caught Hollis's attention was for a strip he knew well. He had flown into it more than a dozen times. It was one of the more remote facilities in the system, situated along a tributary drainage of the middle fork of the Salmon River, accessible only by air or by a multi-day horseback trip. The strip served a small number of outfitters, hunters, and recreational pilots during the flying season, which in that part of Idaho runs roughly from late May through October before snow closes the high country. The NOTAM was simple: airport closed, wildlife hazard, effective until further notice. What made it unusual was the duration. Wildlife NOTAMs for backcountry strips are common. A moose on the runway, elk grazing the approach end, a bear frequenting the camping area. These notices typically last a few days, maybe a week or two at most, until the animal moves on or the caretaker scares it off. This one had been in effect for months, and it showed no sign of being lifted. Hollis asked around. The pilots he knew in the backcountry community had noticed the closure but assumed it was routine. Nobody had flown in to check because the NOTAM explicitly warned against operations at the field. The Idaho Division of Aeronautics, which manages several backcountry strips under agreement with the Forest Service, told Hollis the closure had been initiated by the Forest Service and that questions should be directed to the Salmon Chalice National Forest Supervisor's office. The Forest Service told him the closure was related to ongoing wildlife management concerns and that they could not provide additional detail. Agencies talk like that when the answer is no and the explanation is none of your business. Most people would have let it go. Controllers do not let things go. A backcountry airstrip does not get shut down indefinitely for wildlife unless something extraordinary is happening. These strips exist specifically because they provide access to wilderness that would otherwise be unreachable. Closing one cuts off outfitters from their permitted operating areas. It eliminates emergency landing options in terrain where engine failures and weather diversions kill people. The aviation community in Idaho has spent decades fighting to protect and maintain these facilities. You do not shut one down because a moose wandered onto the runway. Hollis started pulling on the thread the way he knew how, through the FAA system itself. He still had contacts at the Boise Tracon. He still knew people at the flight service station who handled pilot weather briefings and NOTAM dissemination for the Idaho backcountry. He knew retired colleagues who had moved into safety and compliance roles within the agency. And he knew from 25 years inside the federal bureaucracy exactly which channels to use and which questions to ask to get information that was not being volunteered. What he found over a period of several weeks of quiet inquiry was that the wildlife NOTAM was not based on a standard wildlife hazard report. It was based on a series of pilot incident reports that had been filed through the Aviation Safety Reporting System and then flagged internally within the FAA's Regional Safety Office. The reports described encounters at the strip that did not fit any standard wildlife hazard category, and the decision to close the strip had not come from the Forest Service at all. It had come from within the FAA itself, with the Forest Service providing administrative cover by listing the closure under their Land Management Authority rather than as an FAA safety action. The distinction mattered. An FAA-initiated closure based on safety concerns would require documentation, review, and potential public disclosure through the normal regulatory process. A Forest Service land management closure required none of that. Hollis obtained copies of 4 pilot incident reports. He would not tell us exactly how he got them, and we did not press. The reports had been filed by 4 different pilots between September and November of 2019. All 4 described encounters at the same airstrip. All 4 involved operations during twilight or darkness, which is common for backcountry pilots operating in the shoulder seasons when daylight hours are short and flight schedules are dictated by weather windows rather than clocks. And all 4 described observing a large animal on or immediately adjacent to the runway that did not behave like any wildlife species the pilots had encountered in their combined decades of flying the Idaho backcountry. The first of the 4 that Hollis was able to track back to a living pilot willing to talk came from a commercial-rated aviator based in McCall. We will call him Arlo. He had been flying the Idaho backcountry for the better part of 2 decades. He held mountain flying instructor credentials and had logged thousands of hours in single-engine aircraft on big tires in terrain that would terrify most general aviation pilots. He knew every strip in the Frank Church by feel and by sight, and he had landed at this particular facility more times than he could count, in conditions ranging from perfect calm to crosswinds that would make most pilots divert. Arlo is not a person who scares easily, and he is not a person who files incident reports for routine wildlife encounters. You see animals on backcountry runways constantly: deer, elk, moose, the occasional black bear. You buzz the strip on a low pass, they scatter, you come around and land. Nobody files paperwork over a deer. What Arlo saw on the evening of September 14, 2019 was not a deer. He was making his approach from the southwest, descending through the canyon with the river off his left wing. The sun just below the ridgeline to the west, so the strip was in shadow but still visible. He made his standard traffic advisory call on the common frequency 122.9, announcing his position and intentions to any other aircraft in the area. There were none. He was alone. He ran a cockpit audio recorder wired into his intercom because a lot of backcountry pilots keep them running for training review and insurance documentation. That recorder was rolling when his landing lights swept across the runway surface at about 200 feet above the ground, and it captured his voice, making the transmission that eventually made its way to Hollis's file cabinet in Cascade. His first call was routine. Position report, runway in use, standard professional cadence. His second call, the one that came about 45 seconds later, had the same professional calm underneath and something else on top of it. He reported a large animal on the runway. He said it appeared to be standing upright. He added after a pause that on the recording lasts roughly 2 breaths, that whatever it was tall. Arlo's first instinct had been moose. A big cow moose can stand 5.5 feet at the shoulder and weigh close to 1,000 pounds. They are the most dangerous wildlife hazard at Idaho backcountry strips because they are large enough to destroy an aircraft on impact, and they do not always move when you buzz them. What his landing light was illuminating did not look like a moose. The proportions were wrong. The shape was wrong. It was upright, fully upright, standing on 2 legs, and it was big. Arlo estimated its height against the runway edge markers, which stand about 2 feet off the ground. Whatever he was looking at cleared those markers by a wide margin. His estimate, and he emphasized to Hollis that this was an estimate made from a moving aircraft in fading light, was somewhere between 7 and 8 feet. He pushed the throttle forward, added power, and executed a go-around. He climbed out over the far end of the strip, banked left to set up for another pass, and keyed the radio. Then he made another low pass, this time with his landing light aimed directly at the midpoint of the strip where he had seen it. The runway was empty. Whatever had been standing there had moved off the surface in the time it took him to fly around the pattern. Arlo considered landing anyway. The strip was clear, his fuel state was adequate, and he had business at the outfitter's camp accessible from that location. But he made a decision that surprised him as he made it. He did not land. He turned west and flew back to McCall in the dark. He told Hollis it was the first time in his career he had abandoned an approach at a familiar strip for any reason other than weather or a mechanical issue. He said he did not have a rational explanation for the decision. The runway was clear. Conditions were flyable. He simply did not want to be on the ground at that location after dark with whatever he had seen still in the vicinity. He filed the incident report the following day through the Aviation Safety Reporting System, which provides a degree of anonymity to pilots who report safety concerns. The report described the encounter in clinical language. Large unidentified animal, estimated 7 to 8 feet in height, observed standing upright at midfield during approach to landing. Animal departed the runway surface during go-around. Pilot elected to discontinue approach and divert to alternate. Arlo included a recommendation that a wildlife advisory notum be issued for the strip, and that the Forest Service caretaker, if one was assigned to the facility, be notified to assess the situation. Arlo was not the first. 6 days before his encounter on September 8th, a pilot flying a MAL M7 had made a late-season supply run to the same strip and reported hearing unusual vocalizations from the tree line while unloading cargo at dusk. The vocalizations were loud enough to be audible over the engine at idle, which is significant because a bush plane at idle on a gravel strip produces a considerable amount of noise. The pilot described the sounds as unlike any wildlife vocalization he had heard in decades of flying the backcountry. He did not see the source. He finished his unloading quickly, departed before full dark, and filed a brief report noting the unusual wildlife activity. That report was the first in the sequence. The third and fourth reports came in October and late November. The October report described a pilot on a deer hunting trip who landed at the Strip in the afternoon and set up camp near the north end of the runway. Around midnight, he was awakened by heavy footfalls on the gravel runway surface, moving at a pace too slow for a running animal and too heavy for anything he could identify. He turned on a flashlight and aimed it down the runway from his tent. The light reached maybe 150 feet before diffusing into darkness. He saw nothing. The footfalls continued for several minutes, moving from south to north along the runway centerline, and then stopped. The pilot did not sleep the rest of the night. At first light, he walked the length of the runway and found impressions in the soft ground at the edges of the gravel surface. He photographed them with his phone. The photographs, which Hollis eventually obtained, show elongated tracks pressed deep into the soil, roughly 7 inches long, with 4 distinct toe impressions in a pattern that is broadly canine but oversized beyond any wolf or domestic dog. The pilot departed that morning and filed his report within the week. The late November report was the one that turned a pattern into a case. A pilot flying a chartered supply mission for an outfitter pulling out equipment before the Strip became snowbound had mounted a small camera on the wing strut of his aircraft. The camera was a GoPro-style unit designed to record takeoffs and landings for training review. It was running during his approach on an afternoon in late November when the days were short and the light was failing fast. The pilot reported seeing an animal on the runway during his approach and executing a go-around. His verbal report was consistent with the others. Large, upright, moving off the runway as the aircraft passed overhead. Unlike the other pilots, this one had footage. What the wing camera captured is brief and distant and shot from a moving aircraft in low light. The limitations matter. The camera angle is from the wing strut, pointing forward and slightly down, which means the runway surface is visible below and ahead of the aircraft as it passes over the approach end. The image quality at that distance and in that light is marginal. You are looking at a shape on a gravel surface surrounded by dark timber at the edge of twilight. The aircraft is moving, the image is not stabilized, and the resolution makes fine detail impossible. What you can see when Hollis slowed the footage down and studied it is a shape that is clearly not a quadruped. It is upright. The proportions suggest a heavy upper body and a head that, for one brief moment as the shape appears to turn, shows a profile that is elongated in a way no human silhouette produces. The shape moves off the runway surface toward the tree line on the east side of the Strip with a fluidity that is difficult to describe in ordinary language. It does not run the way a bear runs when it drops to all fours to flee. It moves laterally, smoothly, still upright, and then it is in the trees and gone. The whole sequence is over before your brain has time to process what it just showed you. Hollis has reviewed that footage many times. He showed it to 3 people he trusted. 2 were retired aviators with decades of backcountry flying experience. The third was a wildlife biologist who had worked in Idaho's backcountry for years. All 3 said the same thing using different words. They could not identify what they were looking at. The biologist added that the movement pattern, the smooth lateral locomotion while maintaining an upright posture, does not correspond to the biomechanics of any North American species she was aware of. This is the evidence that led to the closure of a backcountry airstrip that had been in continuous operation for decades. 4 independent pilot reports describing the same phenomenon at the same location over a period of 3 months. Physical evidence in the form of photographed tracks, and a piece of video footage that, despite its limitations, shows something on an Idaho runway that the FAA's wildlife hazard classification system has no category for. The FAA's response was to make it disappear. Close the strip, list the reason as wildlife hazard, let the Forest Service take administrative ownership and move on. No investigation, no wildlife assessment, no attempt to identify what the pilots had reported. Close the door, file the paperwork, and trust that professional consequences would keep everyone quiet. Hollis is retired. The professional consequences do not apply to him anymore. And the cognitive wiring that had made him one of the better controllers in the Boise Tracon would not let him leave an unexplained anomaly sitting in the system without resolution. He started doing what controllers do. He gathered data. He cross-referenced reports. He built a picture from fragments. And the picture that emerged is one that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. The airstrip in question sits at an elevation of roughly 5,300 feet in a mountain meadow along a tributary creek that feeds into the Middle Fork of the Salmon River. The Middle Fork is one of the most famous wild rivers in North America, designated as a wild and scenic river, running over 100 miles through the heart of the Frank Church wilderness. The drainage is steep, densely timbered, and almost entirely without human habitation. The nearest year-round residents live in the small communities along the main Salmon River corridor, places like Shoup and North Fork and Salmon itself, which sits at the confluence of the Salmon and the Lemhi rivers in Lemhi County. From the airstrip, the closest paved road is over 50 miles away by air and considerably farther by any ground route that exists. During winter, the strip is buried under several feet of snow and completely inaccessible. Even during the flying season, traffic is light. Maybe a dozen aircraft per month during the busiest periods in late summer and early fall. Fewer in the shoulder seasons. The strip had been established by the Forest Service decades ago as an emergency landing facility and supply point for backcountry ranger stations and fire lookouts. Over time, it became available for public use under the grandfathering provisions that protected existing airstrips when the Frank Church Wilderness was designated in 1980. A caretaker was assigned during the summer months to mow the grass margins, maintain the windsock and runway markers, and provide basic camping facilities for visiting pilots. The caretaker position was seasonal, typically staffed from June through September, with the strip left unattended the rest of the year. The woman who had served as caretaker for several recent seasons is someone Hollis spoke with at length. We will call her Thelma. She was in her early 60s, a retired school teacher from Boise who had taken the seasonal caretaker position because she wanted to spend her summers in the backcountry, and because the solitude suited her temperament. Thelma is a practical woman. She grew up on a ranch in southern Idaho, knew livestock, knew wildlife, knew the difference between a coyote howl and a wolf howl and a dog barking at the end of a chain. She was not easily frightened, and she did not imagine things. Thelma told Hollis she had noticed changes at the strip beginning in the summer of 2019. Wildlife patterns that did not follow the normal seasonal rhythms she had observed over her years at the facility. The elk that usually grazed the meadow during the morning hours stopped coming. The deer that bedded along the creek bottom below the strip were gone by mid-August, weeks earlier than usual. She found their trails, well-worn paths through the timber that had been used for years, abandoned. The game trails showed evidence of being crossed by something that left tracks she did not recognize. Large, heavy, pressed deep into the soil, four-toed and spaced in a pattern that suggested bipedal locomotion. Thelma was not a tracker in any professional sense, but she grew up watching her father and uncles read sign on the ranch, and she had spent enough years in the backcountry to know what elk, deer, bear, wolf, and mountain lion tracks look like. What she found near the strip did not fit any of those categories. The toe structure was canine in its general shape, but oversized dramatically. The stride length between prints when they appeared in pairs along the creek bank was longer than her own stride by a wide margin, and the depth of the impression suggested an animal considerably heavier than the largest wolf she had ever seen or heard of in Idaho. She mentioned the tracks to the Forest Service pilot who made periodic supply flights to the Strip during the summer. He looked at them, took a photograph, and said he would pass the information along. Whether he did or not, Thelma never heard back. She continued her caretaker duties through the end of September, left the Strip for the season as scheduled, and did not return the following summer because the closure had been implemented and the caretaker position was eliminated. What Thelma described about the sounds she heard during her last weeks at the Strip is what connects her observations to the pilot reports that followed. On 3 separate evenings in late August and early September of 2019, after the light had faded and the canyon had settled into the deep quiet that characterizes these drainages after dark, Thelma heard vocalizations coming from the ridgeline east of the Strip. The ridge rises about 1,000 feet above the meadow, densely forested with Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, and the timber runs unbroken for miles in every direction. The sounds came from somewhere in that timber above and to the east, and they carried down through the drainage with the clarity that cold mountain air provides. She described the vocalizations to Hollis as unlike anything she had heard in her years in the Idaho backcountry. They were low in register, deep enough to feel in her chest as much as hear in her ears. They had a rhythmic quality, a rising and falling pattern that repeated with variations. And there was more than one source. On at least one of the 3 evenings, Thelma said she could distinguish 2 distinct vocalizations coming from different positions along the ridge, separated by several hundred yards, occurring in a pattern she described as call and response. One voice would produce a sequence, a pause, then the other would answer from a different position. This went on for several minutes before stopping abruptly. Thelma did not report the vocalizations formally. She had no framework for doing so. The Forest Service does not have a form for unexplained animal sounds heard at a backcountry ranger station. She mentioned them to the same Forest Service pilot during his next visit, and he told her it was probably wolves. Idaho has a significant gray wolf population, particularly in the Frank Church Wilderness, where packs have been established since the reintroduction efforts of the mid-1990s. Wolf howls are common in the backcountry. Thelma had heard wolves many times. She told Hollis, and she was emphatic about this, that what she heard from the ridge was not wolves. The register was too low. The structure was too complex. And wolves do not produce calls that make you feel the sound in your sternum from half a mile away. The convergence of Thelma's observations and the pilot reports creates a timeline that Hollis reconstructed with the precision you would expect from someone who spent a career tracking aircraft movements in 4-dimensional space. The unusual wildlife displacement and the strange tracks begin in mid-summer of 2019. The vocalizations from the ridge occur in late August and early September. The first pilot report, the one noting unusual sounds during cargo unloading, is filed on September 8th. Arlo's encounter, the one with the upright figure on the runway, occurs September 14th. The pattern concentrates in the late summer and fall, building in intensity as the season progresses and daylight shrinks, with the final 2 reports arriving in October and late November as the last pilots of the season used the Strip before winter closed it entirely. What Hollis recognized in this timeline was seasonal territorial behavior. The pattern was consistent with an animal, or more than one animal, that used this drainage as part of a seasonal range. The meadow where the Strip sits, with its creek, its open ground, and its proximity to the river corridor, would be exactly the kind of feature a large territorial predator would use. The runway itself, a flat cleared surface in otherwise dense timber, would function as a travel corridor, an observation point, and a territorial boundary marker all at once. The animal was not appearing on the runway at random. It was using the runway. And it was using it at times when human activity was minimal or absent, which suggested awareness of human patterns and a deliberate strategy of avoidance. If you have spent any time flying the backcountry around the middle fork of the Salmon River, or if you have hiked or rafted that drainage, you know the country I am describing. You know how big it is, how remote, how easy it would be for an animal to live in those mountains for generations, without ever being confirmed by anyone who could prove it existed. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had an unusual experience in that part of Idaho, because based on what Hollis has uncovered, the incident reports from this one airstrip may be part of a pattern that extends far beyond a single location. Hollis's investigation shifted direction in the fall of 2020 when he obtained a piece of information that transformed his understanding of what the pilot reports represented. Through a former colleague at the FAA who had moved into a safety analysis role, he learned that the 4 incident reports from this airstrip were not the only reports in the system describing similar encounters at Idaho backcountry facilities. There were others, not many. Enough. The colleague could not provide copies of the additional reports without risking his position, but he described their contents in general terms during a phone conversation that Hollis recorded with the colleague's knowledge. 3 additional reports from 2 different backcountry strips in the Salmon River drainage, all filed between 2017 and 2020, all describing large, unidentified animals observed during approach or on the runway surface during low-light conditions. 2 of the 3 described the animals as upright. One described an animal that transitioned from a quadrupedal position to a bipedal one as the aircraft passed overhead, standing up on its hind legs in a motion the pilot characterized as deliberate and unhurried, as if it were rising to get a better look at the plane. That behavioral detail stopped Hollis cold when he heard it. An animal that stands up to watch a plane fly over is not displaying a startle response. It is observing. It is gathering information. And it is doing so with a composure that suggests this is not the first aircraft it has ever seen, and not the first time it has made the calculation that the appropriate response is to stand and watch rather than flee. He began researching. He read everything he could find on the subject of large bipedal canine sightings in the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies. He found Linda Godfrey's research, the decades of documented encounters across Wisconsin and Michigan, and the upper Midwest. He found the 1887 Wexford County lumberjack sighting, one of the earliest recorded encounters with what would eventually be called a dogman. He found the Bray Road beast cases from Elkhorn, Wisconsin. He found the work Steve Cook did in 1987 with a song called The Legend that started as a novelty for a radio station in Traverse City, Michigan, and then became a phenomenon when real reports started flooding in from listeners who had been waiting for someone, anyone, to acknowledge what they had seen. He found the Gable film, the hoaxed footage that briefly electrified the community and then, when it was exposed as fabrication, paradoxically strengthened the credibility of the genuine reports by contrast. If one piece of footage is fake, and you can identify exactly why it is fake, then the accounts that do not share those fabrication markers become harder to dismiss. The gap in the research troubled him. There was almost no documented dogman activity in Idaho. The phenomenon, as researchers had mapped it, concentrates heavily in the Great Lakes region, with significant clusters in Wisconsin, Michigan, and the Ohio River Valley, and scattered reports from the Appalachians and the southern states. The Northern Rockies were a blank, a handful of reports from Montana, a few from Washington state, almost nothing from Idaho. That did not mean the phenomenon was absent. It meant nobody had been looking for it there, and the people who might have seen a dogman had no framework for reporting what they saw, and no community of belief to report it to. The absence of reports was, in Hollis's assessment, the most telling finding of all. Idaho's backcountry is the largest expanse of contiguous wilderness in the lower 48 states. Over 4 million acres of designated wilderness in the central mountains alone. Population density in the surrounding counties is among the lowest in the continental United States. Idaho County, where the airstrip is located, covers over 8,500 square miles, an area nearly the size of New Jersey, with a population under 17,000 people. The vast majority of that land is forest, mountain, and river canyon that sees little to no human presence outside of a few months of hunting and recreation season. If a large, intelligent, primarily nocturnal predator wanted to exist without being documented, there is no better place on the continent to do it. And the aviation angle introduced a dimension that no other category of dogman evidence had explored. Pilots see terrain from a perspective that ground-based observers never get. They cover enormous distances in short periods. They are trained observers whose reports carry institutional weight. When a pilot reports a bird strike, the FAA catalogs the species, the altitude, the location, the damage. When a pilot reports a near miss with another aircraft, it triggers a formal investigation. That reporting infrastructure captured a dogman 4 times, and the FAA's response was to suppress the data rather than examine it. The Nez Perce people, who call themselves the Nimiipuu, have inhabited the Salmon River drainage and the surrounding territory of central Idaho for thousands of years. Their ancestral lands centered on the lower Snake River and its major tributaries, including the Salmon and the Clearwater, in what is now northeastern Oregon, southeastern Washington, and the heart of central Idaho. The Nimiipuu were the largest and most powerful of the Sahaptian-speaking peoples, and their relationship with the landscape they inhabited was not merely economic or residential. It was spiritual in a way that informed every aspect of their culture. The wolf holds a position of particular significance in Nez Perce tradition. The Nez Perce word for wolf is Himian. The wolf is understood as a being of intelligence and spiritual power, and the relationship between the Nimiipuu and the Himian is ancient and deep. When the federal government drove gray wolf populations to near extinction in the Rocky Mountains through decades of persecution, the Nez Perce experienced it as a severing of a sacred bond. When wolves were reintroduced to central Idaho in the mid-1990s, the Nez Perce tribe took the lead in managing the recovery program, bringing a combination of modern science and traditional knowledge that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service credited as instrumental to the program's success. The wolf that modern biologists catalog is not the only canine presence in Nez Perce tradition. The Nimiipuu oral histories describe a world in which the mythic past and the human present exist on a continuum that is occasionally breached. Beings from the older world, beings with characteristics that do not map onto any species in the modern biological record, are understood to inhabit places of deep wilderness, places the Nimiipuu approach with specific protocols and specific respect. These are not campfire stories. They are part of a cultural framework for understanding what lives in the landscape and how humans should conduct themselves in its presence. Hollis learned about this context from a retired tribal language instructor on the Nez Perce Reservation in Lapwai, who had spent decades documenting traditional stories from tribal elders. The instructor, who did not want to be identified and whom Hollis spoke with only once by phone, told him that the central Idaho mountains and particularly the drainages of the Salmon River and its forks were understood in traditional Nez Perce knowledge as places where the boundary between the human world and the older world was thin. The beings that inhabited those places were territorial intelligences that had occupied the landscape long before the Nimiipuu arrived, and that would remain long after humans departed. The appropriate response to encountering one was recognition and respect. You acknowledged its presence, you did not challenge its authority in its territory. And you did not speak about it casually or publicly because doing so was understood to invite attention you were not prepared to handle. This framework, developed over millennia of habitation in exactly the terrain where the pilot reports originated, described the same behavioral characteristics the pilot reports documented. Territorial authority, deliberate restraint, awareness of human presence and human technology, a strategy of avoidance that allowed coexistence as long as boundaries were respected. The Nimiapuu had been managing their relationship with these beings for thousands of years, and their management protocol was essentially the same one Thelma had intuitively adopted during her last weeks at the Strip. You noticed them, you respected them, and you did not put yourself in a position where the relationship had to be tested. Hollis spent the winter of 2020 and the spring of 2021 collecting data, cross-referencing reports and building a geographic analysis of the pilot encounters in the context of the broader Idaho backcountry. He plotted every reported sighting and every anomalous notum closure on a topographic map of the Salmon River drainage and its tributaries. The pattern that emerged was not random. The encounters clustered along the river corridors, particularly at confluences where tributary drainages met the main forks of the Salmon. They occurred at or near elevations between 4,000 and 6,000 feet, the transitional zone between the deep canyon bottoms and the high alpine country above timberline. And they concentrated in the late summer and early fall, consistent with seasonal movement patterns of a large predator following prey species as they migrated down from the high country ahead of winter. What the map showed Hollis was exactly what Thelma's wildlife observations had suggested and what the Nez Perce traditions had described. The DOGMAN was using the same travel corridors that every other large predator in the Idaho backcountry uses. River drainages, ridgeline connections, the natural highways that topography creates through mountainous terrain. The airstrip sat directly on one of these corridors, at a point where a tributary creek meets a larger drainage that feeds the Middle Fork. It was, in ecological terms, a pinch point, a place where terrain funnels movement through a narrow zone. Any animal traveling this corridor would pass through that meadow, and a flat cleared gravel surface in the middle of the meadow would be the easiest path through it. The runway was not an obstacle to whatever was using this territory. It was infrastructure. The aircraft that periodically appeared on it were minor inconveniences that arrived on a predictable schedule and could be avoided by stepping into the tree line until they departed. The DOGMAN had integrated the airstrip into its territorial landscape the way it had integrated every other human modification of its environment. Trails become travel routes, clearings become observation points. A flat gravel surface in a mountain meadow becomes the easiest path between where you are and where you are going. In the summer of 2021, Hollis decided to go see the Strip for himself. The NOTAM closure was still in effect, which meant landing an aircraft there would technically violate the FAA notice, something a retired controller with deep institutional loyalty was unwilling to do. Instead, he arranged a horseback trip with a licensed outfitter operating in the adjacent drainage. The ride in took 2 days. Hollis is not a horseman by nature, and he described the experience with dry humor, calling it the longest, slowest flight of his life with the worst seat and no radio. It got him to the Strip. What he found when he arrived confirmed what the reports in Thelma's account had described and added details that no one else had documented because no one else had been on the ground at the facility since the NOTAM went into effect. The runway surface was overgrown but still visible, the gravel base showing through the grass and wildflowers that had colonized it over 2 seasons without mowing. The windsock was still standing, the fabric shredded by wind and weather. The runway markers, the orange and white cones that delineate the edges of the usable surface, were mostly intact, but several had been displaced. 3 of them showed damage that Hollis photographed extensively. Deep gouges in the plastic surface clustered in parallel sets of 4, consistent in their spacing and depth with claw marks from an animal with a hand span considerably larger than a human's, and a grip strength sufficient to deform rigid plastic. The gouges ran vertically from the top of the marker almost to the base, as if the animal had gripped the cone from above and dragged downward. Whatever made them was tall enough to reach down to a 2-foot object the way a grown man reaches down to a fire hydrant. Hollis found tracks, not fresh but preserved in dried mud along the creek bank adjacent to the north end of the runway. The same elongated, 4-toed, oversized canine pattern the hunting pilot had photographed and Thelma had described. Hollis measured them against a folding ruler, 7¼ inches long, 5 inches wide at the widest point. He cast 2 of the best preserved impressions with plaster he had brought in his saddlebag. The stride length between 2 consecutive prints, in a section where the substrate was soft enough to capture a clear sequence, was just over 5 feet. Bipedal locomotion by an animal with a leg length considerably greater than a human's. He spent 2 nights camped at the strip. The outfitter's wrangler stayed at a camp about a mile downstream. The first night was quiet. Cold. Clear. The Milky Way visible in a way it only is when you are 50 miles from the nearest electric light. Hollis lay in his tent and listened to the drainage breathing around him. Water over rocks, wind in the fir canopy, an owl somewhere on the ridge. Normal backcountry sounds, the kind he had come to love during his years of flying into places exactly like this. The second night was different. It started around 11. Hollis was still awake, reading by headlamp, when the forest went quiet. He noticed it the way a controller notices when a frequency goes silent, the absence of expected input. The owls stopped. The insects, which had been providing a steady background hum, stopped. The creek was still audible, but every biological sound source within range had shut down at once, as if someone had pulled the master fader on a mixing board. Hollis turned off his headlamp and lay still. His senses reached outward into the darkness the way they had reached across radar screens for 25 years, scanning for the data point that did not fit. For several minutes there was nothing but the creek and the wind. Then he heard footsteps. They came from the direction of the runway. Heavy, deliberate, spaced at a walking cadence that was too slow for a running animal, and too heavy for anything Hollis could match to his experience. Each step produced a distinct impact on the gravel surface, a crunch that carried through the still air with the clarity of a sound in a dead, quiet room. The steps moved along the runway from south to north, roughly paralleling the creek, and they passed within maybe 100 yards of his tent. He did not move. He did not turn on his light. He lay in his sleeping bag and tracked the footsteps the way he had tracked aircraft on a radar scope, plotting their course, estimating their speed, calculating their distance. The footsteps continued for perhaps 90 seconds. Then they stopped, not faded into distance. Stopped. Whatever was walking had reached a destination, or had stopped to listen, or had become aware of something it wanted to assess. The silence lasted a long time, 5 minutes, maybe 10. Hollis did not check his watch because checking his watch would have required moving, and every instinct he had was telling him not to move. Then, from the ridgeline to the east, the same direction Thelma had described, came a vocalization. Hollis has listened to recordings of every canine species native to North America. Wolves, coyotes, foxes, domestic dogs. He has listened to the audio comparisons compiled by researchers studying canine vocalizations in controlled conditions. What he heard from the ridge that night did not match any of them. It was lower in register than a wolf howl, with a resonance that suggested a chest cavity substantially larger than any wolf's. It had structure, a pattern of rising and falling tones that repeated with variations, as if it was communicating something specific rather than broadcasting a general territorial signal. And it was loud, not just audible at distance, physically impactful, the kind of sound you feel in your body before you consciously process it as a sound. A few seconds after the vocalization from the ridge, a second vocalization answered from somewhere downstream, in the direction the footsteps had been heading. The two voices were distinct, different pitches, different tonal qualities, but operating within the same structural pattern. Call and response, exactly what Thelma had described. The exchange lasted less than a minute, then silence returned to the drainage. The insects started up again about 20 minutes later. The owl resumed from its position on the ridge. By the time Hollis finally looked at his watch, it was past midnight, and he lay awake until dawn, listening to a forest that had resumed its normal rhythms as if nothing had happened. He packed out the next morning. He did not photograph anything during the night because he had decided deliberately not to introduce a light source or a camera into the situation. His reasoning was simple. The FAA cannot classify a dogman. The Forest Service cannot manage a species that has no category in the classification system. Any evidence he brought back would enter an institutional framework that had no place for it, and the response would be suppression, because suppression is the only tool the bureaucracy has for data it cannot process. What Hollis heard that night confirmed what 2 years of research had been pointing toward. The deep drainages of central Idaho harbor an animal that matches the physical description and behavioral profile of a dogman. Large, bipedal, capable, nocturnal, intelligent, and strategically avoidant of documentation. It uses the same terrain every other large predator in the ecosystem uses. It is aware of human technology, including aircraft, and it has adapted its behavior to coexist with human activity at a level of sophistication that suggests knowledge passed between individuals across generations. And the FAA, through the NOTAM closure, quietly eliminated the one context in which trained observers with professional credibility and institutional reporting mechanisms were routinely encountering a dogman and filing reports about it. 4 independent pilots saw it. They filed through the proper channels. The response was to shut down the airstrip and bury the reports. Hollis told us during our last phone call that the irony keeps him up at night. His entire career was built on one principle. A pilot sees a hazard, reports it, and the information gets disseminated to every other pilot who might be affected. The FAA does not evaluate whether the hazard fits a pre-existing category. It takes the report, issues the advisory, and lets every pilot make an informed decision. That principle held for 25 years through every kind of weather event and equipment failure and airspace conflict Hollis ever worked. Then 4 pilots reported a dogman at a backcountry strip in Idaho, and the FAA did the opposite. It took the reports, suppressed the information, and eliminated the conditions under which additional reports could be generated. The mechanism that enforces that silence is not conspiracy. It is bureaucratic architecture. The FAA's wildlife hazard classification system is built around a list of species: deer, elk, moose, black bear, grizzly bear, mountain lion, gray wolf, coyote, various bird species. If a pilot reports a hazard that fits one of those categories, the system processes the report, issues an advisory, and moves on. If a pilot reports a hazard that does not fit any category, the system has nowhere to put it. The report goes to a regional safety office where someone has to decide what to do with it, that someone has a career, that someone has a supervisor, that someone has no interest in being the person who put the phrase large bipedal canine, estimated 7 to 8 feet tall, into an FAA database that journalists can pull through Freedom of Information requests. so the report gets reclassified. Unidentified wildlife, non-standard hazard, and eventually when 4 of them stack up at the same location, the problem gets solved by eliminating the location. Close the strip. Cite wildlife concerns. Let the Forest Service take administrative ownership. Move on. The pilots who filed the reports know what they saw. They know what happens to their reports. They know what happens to their careers if they push too hard. So they stop pushing. They fly to a different strip. They tell the story to 1 or 2 people they trust. And the FAA's classification system continues to insist that central Idaho is home to nothing larger or stranger than a gray wolf, because that is the only kind of animal the forms have a checkbox for. Arlo has not filed another incident report on this subject. He still flies the Idaho backcountry. He knows pilots he believes have had encounters at other strips, pilots who will not talk about it because they have seen what happens to the ones who do. He told Hollis in one of their later conversations that he has started adjusting his own flying in ways he would not have admitted to anyone 2 years ago. He does not land at certain strips after dark anymore. He does not camp alone at remote facilities. He flies with a sidearm now, which is not unusual for backcountry pilots, but which for Arlo represents a specific decision made in response to a specific experience. He carries it for a DOGMAN. He has never said that out loud. He does not need to. Arlo no longer enjoys night flying in the backcountry the way he used to. He is not afraid of the dark. He is afraid of being on the ground after the dark, in a place where he might have to explain to himself what he is seeing at the edge of his landing light. The work still gets done. He still flies supply runs and hunters and the occasional film crew into drainages that most people will never see. He just does it differently now. And the change in how he flies is in its own way a kind of accommodation, the same one Thelma made, the same one the Nez Perce made, the same one Hollis made when he decided not to bring a camera into his tent on the second night at the strip. You adjust. You stop challenging the thing. You let it have the territory after dark, and you take what it allows you to have during the day. Thelma has not returned to the backcountry. She lives in Boise now. Her husband had a health scare the winter after her last caretaker season, and she used that as her public reason for not applying to return. The real reason is the ridge. She told Hollis she does not want to hear those calls again, not because she is afraid of the animals. She believes, and she said this with the conviction of someone who has thought about it a long time, that the animals never meant her any harm. She is afraid of what the calls meant. She thinks they were discussing her. She thinks they had been discussing her for weeks before she left the strip in September of 2019, and she thinks the pattern of her presence in their territory had become interesting enough to them that they were beginning to consider what to do about it. She left before they decided. She does not regret leaving. She does regret that she never asked anyone at the Forest Service why the strip was closed, because she thinks she already knows. And she thinks if she had asked, she might have learned she was not the only person who had heard those voices. The human cost of these encounters extends beyond Arlo and Thelma. Hollis has spoken over the past 3 years with 7 people in the Idaho aviation community who have had experiences they believe involved a DOGMAN. Different strips, different seasons, all in the central Idaho backcountry, all during low-light conditions and all with the same general features. A large upright figure seen at distance, unusual vocalizations, tracks that do not fit any known species, wildlife displacement patterns that cannot be explained by normal predator activity. None of the 7 has filed a report. All 7 have told Hollis in various ways that they would not file a report if they had seen the same thing a second time. The cost of being the pilot who saw a DOGMAN is higher than the benefit of the information being in the system. One of the 7 is a retired outfitter who ran a hunting operation in the Salmon River drainage for nearly 30 years. He told Hollis he had known about the presence of a dogman in his operating area for most of his career, that he had seen one twice at close range, and that he had made a specific decision in the mid-2000s to stop hunting in one particular drainage because of what his horses told him when they entered it. Horses, he said, know. They know before you know. And when a string of horses refuses to enter a drainage they have been worked through for 20 years, you do not push them. You find another drainage. The outfitter retired 2 years ago. He sold his operation to a younger man who has not yet had any of the experiences his predecessor had. The older man expects him to have them eventually. He did not tell the buyer about any of it because he did not think it would help. Another of the 7 is a Forest Service smoke jumper who spent a long career fighting wildfires across the Frank Church. He had been dropped into a fire camp in the summer of 2014, in a drainage that is not the one where the airstrip closure occurred, but which is part of the same river system. On the second night at the camp, he heard the same call and response vocalizations from 2 positions on opposite ridges. He described them to Hollis in language almost identical to what Thelma had used 5 years later about a different drainage. Low register, structured pattern, physical impact on the listener. The smoke jumper had assumed at the time that he was hearing wolves engaged in some kind of vocalization he had not encountered before. After the fire was out and the crew packed up, he asked the senior crew boss about it. The crew boss told him it was not wolves. He did not elaborate. The smoke jumper did not press. The pattern is consistent. The evidence accumulates. The institutional response ensures that it never coalesces into anything the broader public can see. A pilot in one drainage, a caretaker in another, an outfitter in a third, a smoke jumper in a fourth. All of them experiencing the same phenomenon within a geographic area roughly the size of Vermont, and none of them connected to each other except through the quiet work of one retired controller who happened to notice an anomalous notum and could not let it alone. The question Hollis has not been able to answer, and which has moved to the center of his thinking over the past year, is what the right response looks like. He has a filing cabinet full of evidence. He has pilot testimony, physical casts, photographs, the wing camera footage, an audio recording of 2 voices calling to each other across a drainage at midnight while he lay in a tent and listened. He has the institutional documentation of the suppression. He has the indigenous context from the Nez Perce elders who describe the same behavior using a vocabulary thousands of years older than anything the FAA has access to. He has enough material to make a case in the right form that would be difficult to dismiss. What he does not have is a forum. Going public with evidence of a dogman at an FAA-regulated facility would burn the people who helped him access the information. It would draw hunters and media and amateur investigators to a drainage where the equilibrium between the animals and the landscape depends on human absence. It would trigger deeper suppression, not investigation, more closures, tighter restrictions, greater consequences for anyone who talks. The Nez Perce understood this dilemma long before Hollis encountered it. Their traditional protocols include silence. You do not speak about these beings publicly. You do not bring outsiders to their territory. You do not force a confrontation that could alter a relationship maintained through restraint on both sides for longer than anyone can remember. The Nimipu managed this coexistence for millennia by treating it as a fact of the landscape, not a problem to be solved. Hollis has arrived at a version of the same understanding. He does not know what a dogman is in the taxonomic sense. He does not know how many of them use the Salmon River drainage, though the evidence suggests more than one. What he knows is what the pilot reports show, what the tracks confirm, what the footage captured, and what two voices on a ridgeline communicated to each other across a drainage at midnight while he lay in a tent and listened. Pilots who fly the Idaho backcountry today have largely forgotten about the closed strip. There are other strips. The backcountry is large. The loss of one facility is an inconvenience. The Idaho Aviation Association, which fights hard to protect airstrip access, has not challenged this closure because the official justification, wildlife management, falls within the Forest Service's legitimate authority. Nobody outside a very small circle knows the real reason the strip went dark. The evidence sits in Hollis's filing cabinet in Cascade, Idaho, waiting for a context in which it can be heard. The pilot reports are buried in an FAA database that was never designed to surface them, but that cannot delete them either. The photographs exist, the plaster casts exist, the wing camera footage exists. The Nez Perce traditions exist, carried in the memory of a people who have been managing their relationship with these beings since long before anyone thought to build a runway in their territory. Out in the drainages of the Middle Fork, in terrain that humans visit for a few weeks each summer and then abandon to the cold and the snow, the old paths are still being walked. The ridgelines still connect one drainage to the next. And on still nights when cold air carries sound for miles through the canyons, a gravel runway that was built for airplanes serves a traveler that was here long before anyone thought to flatten a meadow and call it an airport. Hollis told us one more thing before he ended our last conversation. He said the sound he heard that night, the vocalization from the ridge, had a quality he has never been able to shake. It was not aggressive. It was not a threat display. It sounded, and he paused for a long time before saying this, like language, like structured communication between two individuals who understood each other and who were exchanging specific information about something in their environment. He said he thinks they were talking about him. He does not know if that is true. He cannot prove it. He has spent 25 years listening to voices on a frequency, processing the information they carry, distinguishing between routine communication and transmissions that carry urgency or intention or meaning beyond their literal content. He knows what structured communication sounds like. And what came off that ridge in the dark, two voices in the wilderness calling back and forth across a drainage humans have been visiting for less than a century. And the DOGMAN and its kind have been inhabiting for longer than anyone can measure, sounded to Hollis like two intelligences exchanging information about the thing lying quietly in a tent beside the runway. He did not sleep that night. He has not slept easily since. The Idaho backcountry is still the largest contiguous wilderness in the lower 48. The Frank Church alone covers over 2 million acres. The Salmon River still runs wild through canyons most Americans will never see. The airstrips are still there, most of them, maintained by volunteers and funded by a community of pilots who believe access to wild places is worth fighting for. The flying season opens in late spring and the bush planes come back, threading through canyons and touching down on gravel strips that connect the modern world to something ancient and immense. One strip remains closed. Its runway is growing over with grass. Its windsock is in tatters. Its markers are scarred with claw marks nobody from the Forest Service has come to examine. The NOTAM is still active in the system, a single line of text that reads the same as it did the day it was issued. Wildlife hazard, closed until further notice. The further notice has not come. Hollis does not believe it ever will.